4,000 years ago. A scribe in ancient Mesopotamia pressed a list of kings into wet clay, and the list begins with a sentence that should not be possible. It says that kingship descended from heaven. It says the first king ruled for 28,800 years. His successor ruled for 36,000. And it goes on like that, reign after impossible reign for tens of thousands of years, until, in a single line, it records that the flood swept over. The document is called the Sumerian King List. It is real. It exists in multiple ancient copies, and for 4,000 years, it has confronted everyone who reads it with the same impossible claim that before a great flood, human kings lived and ruled for tens of thousands of years each. Now, no human being lives for 30,000 years. We know that, so the question is not whether the numbers are literally true. The question is darker and far more interesting. Why did the Sumerians write them down at all? And is there a real memory buried inside them? Start with the place, Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now Iraq. This is, by most reckonings, the cradle of civilization. It is here, more than 5,000 years ago, that human beings built the first true cities: Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Kish. It is here that the wheel, the plow, organized irrigation, and the first systems of law took shape. And, above all, it is here that human beings invented writing, and that last invention changes everything about how we can see the past. Before writing, we have only stone, bone, and ruins, objects that cannot speak. But with writing, for the first time, the ancient world talks back. The Sumerians wrote on clay, pressing a reed stylus into wet tablets, making the wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform. And clay, once it dries or is baked, is almost immortal. We have hundreds of thousands of their tablets, receipts, letters, contracts, poems, and king lists. The Sumerian King List is one of those documents. It survives in around a dozen or more copies and fragments, the most complete and famous, inscribed on a clay prism, roughly 4,000 years old. It is, on its surface, a simple thing, a list. It names the cities of Mesopotamia that held kingship, one after another, and the kings who ruled in each, and how long each king reigned. A political document, a record of who held power. But the beginning of the list is not political at all. The beginning is myth. Let's read it. The king list opens with a line that scholars translate, roughly, as, when kingship descended from heaven. Kingship was in Eridu. And then it begins to list the antediluvian kings, the kings before the flood, with their reigns. The first king of Eridu is given a reign of 28,800 years. The second, 36,000. Kingship then passes to other cities, more kings, more vast reigns. 18,600 years, 43,200, on and on. Add the antediluvian reigns together, and the totals are staggering, depending on which copy you read. The kings before the flood are said to have ruled, in total, for something on the order of 240,000 years. 250,000 years of human kingship before a single drop of the flood had fallen. These numbers are not history in any literal sense. No person lives that long. No dynasty does. The numbers read plainly, simply, break. And then comes the line that splits the document in two. After the last antediluvian king, the king list records in a single stark sentence, the flood swept over, and then, crucially, something changes. After the flood, kingship descends from heaven a second time, and the list goes on. But the reigns begin to shrink. The first kings after the flood still have very long reigns, over 1,000 years. But as the list continues, generation by generation, the numbers come down and down until, by the end, the kings reign. For ordinary human spans, 20 years, 30, a normal lifetime. Let's stop on that flood, because the king list is not the only ancient Mesopotamian text that records it. The flood is everywhere in their literature. The Mesopotamians told the flood story again and again. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest great work of literature we possess, a survivor named Utnapishtim describes how the gods sent a deluge to wipe out humankind, and how he was warned, built a great vessel, loaded it with his family and with living things, and rode out the storm. In an older text, the Atrahasis epic, the same story is told with a different hero. And of course, anyone hearing this will recognize the shape of it: a flood, a warning, a vessel, a survivor. The Mesopotamian flood stories are centuries older than the version in the book of Genesis, and the parallels are unmistakable. So the flood in the king list is not an isolated detail. It sits at the center of an entire civilization's memory. And here is where it gets genuinely interesting, because there may be a real event underneath it. Mesopotamia is a flat floodplain between two great rivers. It floods. It has always flooded. And archaeologists digging at ancient Mesopotamian cities have found in places thick layers of water-laid silt, flood deposits, sometimes meters deep, sealing one layer of human settlement from the next. At the city of Ur, a famous excavation found exactly such a flood layer. Real floods, catastrophic ones, burned into the ground itself. Now, we have to be careful. No single flood layer found so far covers all of Mesopotamia at once. The flood deposits at different cities date to different times. So there is no proof of one universal deluge. But that may be missing the point. To the people living in a single city, a flood that destroyed their entire world, their fields, their homes, everyone they knew, would feel like the end of everything. Local, in the geological sense. Total, in the human one. The flood in the king list may be a real memory of a real catastrophe, magnified by retelling into the flood that ended an age. So now, to the central puzzle. The Sumerians were not fools. They were sophisticated administrators, people who used numbers every single day, who tracked grain and silver and livestock with precise accounting. They knew how long a human being lives. So, why would careful, numerate people write down reigns of 30,000 years as if they belonged in an official record? There are several serious answers. The first is about legitimacy. The king list is, at its heart, a political document. Its real purpose was to argue that kingship was a single sacred thing, handed down from the gods, passed from one city to the next, held at any moment by exactly one rightful king, giving the earliest kings superhuman reigns, did something powerful. It rooted the institution of kingship in a deep, divine, almost timeless past. The longer the reigns, the more the office of king seemed eternal and beyond question. The second answer is about mathematics, and it is genuinely striking. Researchers who studied the antediluvian numbers noticed something. The Sumerians used a base 60 number system. The reason we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle, and many of the giant reign lengths turn out to be clean, highly composite numbers. In that base 60 system, built from a small set of sacred, round mathematical units, the numbers are not random. They appear to be constructed, assembled out of meaningful ratios, which suggests the reigns were never meant as measurements. They were meant as a kind of sacred arithmetic. And here is where the ancient aliens crowd leans in close. And honestly, the appeal is obvious. Kingship descends from heaven. Kings who live for tens of thousands of years. To some readers, this reads instantly as a literal account of visitors from the sky, of long-lived beings who ruled the early earth and were remembered as gods or as god-kings. The mainstream reading is the one we have just laid out. Legitimacy and sacred mathematics. But notice the shared ground again. Both sides agree. The king list is telling us something about how the Sumerians understood their own origins as something that came from above. Now let's return to the most haunting feature of the whole document, the shrinking, the way the rains, after the flood, come down and down until they reach ordinary human length. Think about what that pattern does. At the start of the list, the deep, mythic past, the numbers are vast and impossible. In the middle, the time just after the flood, they are large but shrinking. And by the end, the recent past, the part the scribes could check against real records, the numbers are realistic. In other words, the further back in time the king list looks, the more unreliable and inflated its numbers become, and the closer it comes to the scribe's own day, the more it sobers into history. That is a profound thing for a 4,000-year-old document to do, because it is, in a sense, honest about its own limits. It is a record of how human memory actually behaves close to us. The past is sharp. We have dates, names, real spans. But the deeper back we reach, the more memory dissolves into legend, and legend inflates. Time itself seems to stretch the further away it gets. The king list is not just a list of kings. It may be the oldest surviving portrait of the horizon of human memory, the line beyond which history becomes myth. And there is a tantalizing possibility folded inside that. What if the antediluvian section is not pure invention, but a compressed, distorted memory of something genuinely ancient? The Sumerians built their cities around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. But human beings had been living in Mesopotamia, farming, building villages for thousands of years before that. Long, dim ages of human life before the first written record. It is possible that the impossible rains before the flood are a folk memory's way of saying something true, that before our cities, before our records, there was a vast stretch of time when people were already here. Now we come to the strangest companions of the antediluvian kings, because Mesopotamian tradition does not only remember kings before the flood, it remembers teachers. In Mesopotamian myth, the antediluvian kings were advised by a group of beings called the Apkallu, the 7 sages. According to the tradition, these sages were sent by the God of wisdom to bring civilization to humankind, to teach human beings the arts of the city, agriculture, law, crafts, writing, the very foundations of ordered life, and the most famous of them, a sage often called Adapa or Oannes, is described in a startling way as a being who emerged from the water, who had something of the form of a fish, and who came ashore to teach, and then returned to the sea. Stop and feel the weight of that. The Sumerians' own explanation for where their civilization came from was this: knowledge was not invented by ordinary humans. It was brought, delivered, taught by sages who came from elsewhere, beings associated with the water and with the heavens. This is the ancient aliens crowd's favorite passage in all of Mesopotamian literature, and it is easy to see why. A fish-like teacher rising from the sea to hand humankind the gift of civilization sounds to a modern ear like a visitor in a suit from a craft beneath the waves. But here is the grounded reading, and it is, I think, more beautiful than the alien one. The Apkallu story is the Sumerians trying to explain a real and genuine mystery, the sheer, dizzying strangeness of civilization itself. Imagine being among the first city dwellers. You possess writing, mathematics, law, monumental architecture, astronomy, and you have no historical record of any of it being invented because the invention happened before records existed. So how do you explain the knowledge you hold? You say it was given to you by sages before the flood from the gods. The Apkallu are not necessarily aliens. They may be the memory of a mystery the Sumerians genuinely could not solve. The same mystery this whole channel keeps circling. Before we close, let me show you the part of the Sumerian king list that almost nobody talks about. The part where this strange, mythic document turns out to be telling the truth. Once the king list moves past the flood and into its later sections, something important happens. It starts naming kings who are real, kings whose existence has been confirmed by completely separate evidence, by their own inscriptions, by archaeology, by other documents. Rulers like Gilgamesh himself, the hero of the great epic, appears in the king list as an early king of Uruk, and most scholars now think there may well have been a real historical king behind the legend. Later, kings on the list, like Sargon of Akkad, are firmly, indisputably historical. So think about what that means for how we should read this document. The Sumerian king list is not pure fantasy, and it is not pure history. It is both braided together. Its later sections are a genuine, usable historical source, one that historians actually rely on to reconstruct the sequence of Mesopotamian dynasties, and its earliest sections are myth. The document is a single, continuous thread that runs from legend into fact, with no clear line marking where one becomes the other. And that is the real lesson of the king list. It warns us against two opposite mistakes. The first mistake is to throw the whole thing away, to see the impossible numbers and dismiss the entire document as nonsense. Do that, and you discard a genuine historical record. The second mistake is to believe all of it literally, to take the 30,000-year reigns as fact. Do that, and you have left history entirely. The careful path runs between reading the king list as what it is, a civilization's memory of itself, partly true, partly sacred, and entirely worth listening to. Here is what I keep coming back to. The Sumerian king list is one of the oldest attempts human beings ever made to write down their own deep past, and when they tried, this is what came out: a story in which kingship falls from the sky, in which sages rise from the sea to teach us, in which the earliest rulers live for tens of thousands of years, and in which a great flood divides the world that was from the world that is. We could laugh at the numbers, but that would be a mistake, because buried inside this strange document are real things, a real institution of kingship, real kings, a real sophisticated mathematics, a real and terrible memory of catastrophic floods, and a real, honest acknowledgement encoded in those shrinking rains that the deeper you look into the past, the hazier it becomes. The Sumerians were not lying to us. They were doing exactly what we are doing right now on this channel, trying to see before history and being honest about how hard it is to see. The king list is not a hoax, and it is not a literal chronicle. It is a mirror. It shows us a civilization staring back into its own origins and finding where the records run out: gods, sages, a flood, and kings who seemed to live forever before history. There was a list pressed into clay. It begins in myth and ends in fact. And the most honest thing about it is that it never tells us exactly where the one becomes the other. If this episode shifted something in your head about how memory and myth braid together in the oldest records, about how recently human beings learned to write the past down at all, then know that the Sumerian king list is only one ancient voice among many. Flood myths, origin stories, and god-king legends survive from nearly every early civilization, an entire chorus of human beings long gone, trying to explain where they came from. If you want to come along as we listen to what they wrote, subscribe to Before History, because the further back we look, the more the past itself turns into legend. See you in the next one. Yes, embedded in closing vow, no cadence promise.